I'm here to start a short new series about some of the themes in the Spanish game, or the Ruy Lopez opening, which goes as such. White will play e4 and black e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. Of course, there are other moves than bishop b5 here. There's knight c3, there's bishop c4, and there's d4. And there's other ways that games can play out, but really if white wants to try to get anything against e4, e5, it's basically been proven that the Ruy Lopez is the only real way of achieving this. So we're starting to get into a lot of rich chess where there's many positional ideas, and oftentimes the game will be more of a positional maneuvering type, but then at some particular point really open up and get really tactical. So there's a few lines I'd like to just mention really quickly that I'm not really going to go over in any detail because it's just a different kind of theme. There's the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez. A6 is black's main move here. And the exchange variation is bishop takes c6. Now, I don't believe that white really can get much of anything in this variation. It's not going to get an advantage, but the point is here the pawn structure and the piece coordination is extremely different than in most standard Ruy Lopez positions, so we're not going to look at this really. One thing I should point out, though, is in this position, many of you might think, well, knight takes e5 just wins a pawn, but black will respond with queen d4, picking up the pawn right back. So that's one variation. Another variation is this move, knight f6. This is known as the Berlin defense, or the Berlin wall, so to speak, and it follows where white castles. Black takes this pawn on e4. White plays d4, and now black plays sort of a funny-looking move, knight d6. The point is, he wants to either play e4 or e takes d4, but if he takes on d4 now, then white plays rook e1. He eschews taking this pawn on d4 back. Black then has to play something like d5, after which white plays knight takes d4, pinning this knight too, and there's always tons of pressure, and it's likely that black's going to end up in serious trouble. So after knight d6, black attacks this bishop, and there's some lines like d takes e5, knight takes b5, a4, trapping the knight, but quite frankly, I don't believe in them at all. I think that white needs to take on c6 now. Black takes back with the d pawn, white plays d takes e5, and then knight f5, queen d8, king d8, and there's lots of ways of playing this. Basically, black can't castle, he's a bit down in development, and white and his pawn structure is crippled, but he does have a very solid position and the bishop pair, which in the long run is going to be a big asset. But again, this is not a particularly normal, I guess, quote unquote, Lopez middle game, so we're going to not look into this too much, but since it's such a major part of chess these days, I figured I should at least mention that it does indeed exist. So, after bishop b5, a6 is the main move, as I alluded to before, and now white usually plays bishop a4. Knight f6, castles, and so here's another line that we're not going to look into too much, is knight takes e4. This is the open Ruy Lopez, where black grabs this pawn. White plays d4, just like in the Berlin, except now black plays it a little differently. He plays b5, bishop b3, and now d5. And white plays d takes e5, attacking this pawn. Bishop e6. And material's been equalized. White has his plans, black has his plans. White will probably play like knight bd2. His plan may consist of something like c3 and bishop c2, putting this bishop on an excellent diagonal. And then maybe something like knight d4, preparing to push through f4 and f5 and trying to create an attack. Meanwhile, black probably will play like knight c5 and try to play d4 to gain some space. Another plan is to play f5 and try to just hold everything together. I don't know if f5 is good here specifically, but say bishop e7, c3, and now f5. It's all very interesting, but again, we're not going to look too much into that. So now that I'm basically done talking about what we won't look at, I'm going to talk about what we will look at. Okay, so the main idea for black in the Ruy Lopez, or the sort of closed variations that we're going to talk about, is to play bishop e7 followed by d6, or well, first to play b5, and then to play d6. And I think this is probably the main way of playing these days. There's of course other variations. For example, black can play bishop c5. This is known as the archangel. Or they should, if they're going to play this way, they should probably play b5 first, and now bishop c5. And there's some complicated variations. But bishop e7. So now he really is threatening to take this pawn, because if white plays, let's say c3, trying to play d4, black takes this pawn. If d4, black can just take it, because if rook e1, black just retreats and castles next move. He doesn't have this pin on the e file because the bishop is breaking the pin. So after bishop e7, rook e1 is kind of crucial. And now if black just castles, I should point out white actually now really is threatening to take on c6, followed by taking on e5. Because if black plays queen d4, well, white just comes back to f3, and black can't take this pawn with the queen, because the rook is defending it. So black has to play b5 now. White plays bishop b3, and now castle. So there's a lot of ideas here. We get to sort of like a kind of position where this is really the starting breeding ground for any real Ruy Lopez. White has sort of a funky try with d4 here, and some let's say knight takes d4, knight takes d4, e takes d4. Should point out it would be a terrible mistake to play queen takes d4, because now black will play c5, attacking the queen, and the next move he will play c4, trapping and winning this bishop on b3 and winning the game. But after e takes d4, white can play this move e5, knight e8. White still can't really take this pawn, but white can play c3, dc3, and knight c3. And this has been tested out a few times. It appears that white easily has enough for the pawn, but not more, because he's going to play knight d5 if he wants to. Black's extremely cramped, but usually black will have to play something like d6. And it's basically been found that black can untangle all of his pieces and equalize at the expense of giving up his extra pawn. So this is basically equal. And the main move here is c3. So there's other ideas like playing a4 and h3. But the main point is that after c3, black has this move d5 called the Marshall attack, which is very popular on top levels. So one thing about the Ruy Lopez is black playing d5 is always a very key theme. If black can play d5, he's usually, and do it safely, he's usually in excellent shape. In this case, he can't quite do it quote-unquote safely, because white can take and then take a pawn on e5. But in this position, when black plays c6, he's really ready to start developing a dangerous initiative with moves like bishop d6 and queen h4. And this has been played at top levels very often, and the best play usually ends up in some pawn down endgame for black, where he's got excellent chances to draw. There's many such endings. Like, for example, I believe one of them goes d4, or sorry, not d4, d3, bishop d6, rook e1, queen h4, g3, queen h3, queen f3, bishop f5, bishop d5, cd5, queen d5, rook a d8, queen g2, king g2, and bishop d3. And if you look at this ending, white is better because he has an extra pawn. Black has the powerful bishop pair. He's up in development. His rooks are going to be better placed than white's, and for the most part, black's usually holding a draw in these endgames. There's plenty of other ones that are very similar, and there's also in the Marshall, if white really wants to take the plunge, we can get to some really sharp lines after something like, let's say, queen h4. G3, queen h3. Let's say there's this move like bishop e3 and then bishop f5, and it's really going to end up more in an attacking game. There's lots of ways for that to happen as well, but usually at top levels it ends up with a slightly worse endgame for black if they manage to hold. So that's why some people avoid the Marshall, but for now we're just going to let it happen because usually black, if he doesn't want to just make a draw, will play d6. So now there's a couple ways white can play this position. He can play d4 right away, which allows bishop g4 from black, which puts white's center under some serious pressure. It's very hard to see how he's going to defend against all the threats. For example, this pawn on d4 is under pressure, and the only real way it seems to defend it, because if bishop e3, then this pawn on e4 is hanging. And if knight bd2 trying to hold this pawn, then e takes d4. And in the meantime, black's threatening to kill white's pawn structure with bishop takes f3. I think the best way for white to play after bishop g4 is d5, knight a5, bishop c2. So at this point, we've seen the pawn center with white's played d5, which means it's no longer fluid. There's no longer things that are really happening in the center with pawns on e5 and d4. But here black makes this break with c6. So white plays h3, kicking this bishop away. And this is kind of a funny theme here, but the best square for the black bishop is actually all the way back on c8. And a lot of people will say, you know, why did you play it to g4 in the first place? Well, it kind of forced white to play d5, and now his center is coming under pressure from this pawn on c6. So d takes c6, and now a lot of people will just naturally just say, okay, knight takes c6, you know, what's there to worry about for black? Well, this probably isn't the best move, because now let's say white plays bishop g5, and, you know, slowly but surely he's going to try to attack this square. And, you know, if he can, let's say, play knight bd2, knight f1, knight e3, and then take this guy and drop a knight on d5, it's a slow plan, but in the long term, it's going to be very powerful. And if black ever plays d5 himself, white will take and open up a monstrous bishop along this diagonal with lots of threats. So actually, as it turns out, the best move for black here is queen c7, intending to take the pawn back with the queen and prepare d5 faster. So it's a very rich position, but it's also something we're not going to look at in too much detail. So the main idea for white is not to allow bishop g4. It's to play h3. So now there's lots of sort of funky tries that can be done here. Like, for example, rook e8 is sort of all the rage these days. Or no, bishop b7, d4, and then this move rook e8. So black has a weird plan. He's going to play bishop to f8, then g6, bishop g7, and he's trying to put pressure on the center by these two fianchettoed bishops. And in the meantime, white's plan is probably going to be something like knight bd2, and let's say d5, and then after knight a5, bishop c2, then trying to play for c4 someday to hold the center in case intact. So for example, let's play a couple moves. Knight bd2, rook e8, d5. So if black plays knight a5, this knight seems out of place, and it's going to get kicked with b4 next move, forcing knight c4. Knight takes c4, b takes c4, and this pawn c4 is weak. For example, say c6, b4, knight c4 takes, d takes c6. I think white can be comfortable with some advantage here because he'll be able to do stuff with the a and the b pawns, and the c pawn for black is always weak. So in general, after knight bd2, if knight bd2, bishop f8, d5, knight b8 is the move, and black's going to try to play knight 8 d7 and c6. So white will play something like bishop c2 and then knight d7, and you know, white can play, let's say, a4 and try to play for b3, like let's say b3 and c4, keeping everything solid, and then trying to maybe do stuff on the king side. And in the meantime, black can try to open things up on the queen side. Another way this position can often play out is if white doesn't change the character of the center, and something like this happens. Knight g3, bishop g7, let's say bishop c2. Now, one thing black might do is knight b8 anyway, and just trying to go to d7. And so it's a a4, knight d7. If black can play d5, like in most Ruy Lopez's, he's going to have a good position, because the center opening should favor him. Should also point out that in general, white taking on e5 is always going to favor black as well. Although in this position you have to calculate, because white does seem to win a pawn, but it's likely that he won't be able to hold on to this because black has good compensation. I'm not sure about this specific position, but let's say if black played black can play knight b8 earlier, for example, in this position, or bishop f8, knight f1. Okay, sorry, knight f1 is impossible now, because this is another theme for black, is e takes d4, and then this pawn on e4 hangs. So white would have to play bishop c2 first, and now black could play knight b8. And there's lots of themes like this, where black tries to reroute this knight to d7, which helps support d5 and open up this bishop on b7. And there's lots of ways of playing this position. This is sort of called like the Bray or Chigorin types of systems. So that's one idea. But another one is to play d6, and now if d4, since bishop b7 is sort of a more recent thing, a more classical way of playing is, h3, knight a5, bishop c2, c5. c5 is the more classical way, playing knight a5, bishop c2, c5. So now white plays d4. And black probably shouldn't resolve the tension in the center right away. White's threatening to win a pawn here on e5, but there's many moves black can play. Black can play knight c6, black can play queen c7, and he can play knight d7. So each of these has different points. Knight c6, white probably is best advised to just kick this knight right away. And it seems a little odd that black just plays knight c6 only to get it kicked, and it probably has to go back to b8. So the main move here, I think, is queen c7. And now knight bd2. And in this case, black will play c takes d4, and then knight c6. Now the point of playing it this way is that now if white plays d5, black has a very nice square on b4. So bishop b1. Now white is threatening a3, trapping the knight. But black has a good way of dealing with this. So I'll actually give you guys a couple seconds if you want to pause the video and try to find what the best move for black is. Okay, so the move black should play is a5, which gains space on the queen side, and he's ready to play knight a6 in case of a3. And then his plan might be something like bishop d7, rook f c8, and try to play along this open c file. However, while it does look like black has a lot of play, if you try to point to a single square on the c-file black can really use well, it's not so easy to do. And meanwhile, white can try to play on the king side, for example. Let's say a3, knight a6, knight f1, and white may try to play g4 and knight g3, maybe knight f5 or g5 or both, and try to set an attack up. So this is also a very rich kind of position where there's lots of ideas going on. So while knight c6 first in this position seems strange, another idea is to do this, but I don't think it's as powerful here because white hasn't committed his knight to d2 just yet. So now white can play knight c3 and look at this weak d5 square. So another point after queen c7, knight bd2, c takes d4, knight c6, is white doesn't have to play d5 now. There's many things white can do. I think I've seen b3 played before, just trying to put this bishop on b2, and that's going to put pressure on the center, and if black ever takes this, a bishop on the long diagonal will be very powerful. And I've also seen knight b3, the idea of defending this with a knight. Black will play a5, trying to kick the white knight with a4, and now white plays bishop e3, protecting the pawn again, a4, and then knight back to d2. So if you look, really all that's changed between this position and the one a couple moves ago is this bishop that was on c1 is now on e3, and this pawn that was on a6 is now on a4. So black has gained space on the queen side, but white has also been able to defend this pawn in the center, and he can quickly play moves like rook c1, bishop b1, which he wouldn't have been able to do before. He's now activating his rook and trying to put it on good squares, and after bishop b1, his queen side's very solid. So this is another way for white to play, and it's a very interesting variation. So one other way after d4 for black to play is this funky move knight d7. So it seems strange at first, why are you moving your knight away? But it has a key point, and that's that it's really almost saying like, White needs to find a move to play because black's plan is going to be to play e takes d4, c takes d4, and knight c6. So if white plays the most natural move, knight bd2, then this is much more effective because if you can imagine in this position, if this knight on d2 or on c3 instead, then the knight coming to d5 would be a very powerful piece. But here the knight on d2 looks kind of stupid. So if white can play a waiting move, black probably shouldn't play e takes d4 right away, or it won't be as effective. But it's hard to find a good waiting move in this position because white can't really find a good square for this bishop on c1. If bishop e3, then knight c4, attacking the bishop, trying to trade it off for the inferior knight on a5, also attacking b2. And bishop c1 is basically the only move. And here I'm sure this isn't the best move. I'm sure black has much better options at his disposal, but one possibility would be just to play knight back to a5 and repeat the position. And, making a quick draw with the black pieces is never something to be frowned upon. So there's a couple ideas for white here. One is to play d5, and that now after knight b6, black will try to play for f5, and so something like this could happen. Now black has a choice. He can play f5 right now, and get a position like this one where he has the open f-file and white has a weak d5 pawn, but big concession from black's part is that white has this nice e4 square for the knight, or black can play g6 with the intention of that old phrase, every Russian schoolboy knows to recapture an f5 with the pawn. So black is going to try to play f5 and then take back with a pawn. And this is also a very interesting way of playing. However, the main way, I think, of playing this position for white is indeed to play knight bd2. ed4, cd4, knight c6. And now there's a couple things white can do. White can play d5, or he can play knight f1. Those are the only two main moves. So after d5, knight ce5, takes, we get a Benoni-like structure, sort of, although black hasn't fianchettoed his king's bishop. So he's also achieved c5 and b5 very quickly, but this can sometimes be a liability as well. For example, white plays a4 here, and black doesn't really want to allow a takes b5, so rook b8 is the main move. And now f4, knight g6, knight f3, and if you look, white's ready to push through with e5 and start to make his center roll. There's lots of things that could happen here, but one line goes bishop h4. And now, if white takes this bishop, queen takes, he has to do something about this f4 pawn, and it's really not easy at all to see what that's going to be. Because if rook f1, bishop takes h3, g takes h3, queen g3 check, black just draws by perpetual check with queen takes h3 and queen back to g3. Queen f3, well, there's a pretty simple win for black here. I'll let you pause your videos for about 4 seconds to find it. Okay, queen takes e1, seems to win a rook. So, and if f5, then knight e5, and white is really conceded to letting this knight get to a wonderful square, and he's got easy plans of playing rook to e8. However, there's always counterplay. White can play ab5, and try to use this a-file. Maybe harass black's pawn on d6 somehow. One key idea here is to play rook f1, with the intention of playing f6. And if black plays f6 himself, then his queen gets into trouble. So, and white can also try to play bishop f4. And this is also, like many of the other positions in the Ruy Lopez, a very rich variation, where lots of things can happen. So, and lots of different ideas come into play. And usually the player who understands the positions better is going to win. That's why I think it's more important to be experienced in the Ruy Lopez to play it well than to know theory per se. So there's also, after bishop h4, more aggressive ways of playing for white, like rook f1, and not letting black trade off right away. So bishop g3 is a move, and now I'm not quite sure exactly what the main move for white is here. I know f5 is possible. I know that black also has tried f5 in this position himself, and after e5, de5, fe5, bishop b7, d6, bishop h4, played a position like this one where white has two powerful connected passers, but it's hard to see how to advance them, and in the meantime, his king is starting to come under some serious pressure. So There's really lots of ways of playing the Ruy Lopez. It always gets to an interesting position. And there's many other variations too, other than playing knight a5 and c5. Like, while that's the main thing, and bishop b7, the Chigorin has come into play recently, there's lots of other ways of playing. Like recently at the US Junior Tournament, which I played in, my friend and roommate, Sal Bursis, in this position played knight d7. Now, to an untrained eye, this might just look like a funky move. He's just like in the last position, he's moving his knight away from the action. But here, he doesn't even plan on going to e5 with it, or making things happen with c5 and d4. But black's idea is to play bishop f6, always putting pressure on white's center. So, for example, white plays d4, bishop f6, and white's center is under some pressure. Nothing is threatened just yet, but it's harder to develop. For example, knight d2, which is a move white wants to play to bring it to f1, fails on account of e takes d4. So, while white doesn't need to do this right away, black is banking on the fact that it's likely white's going to have to play d5, and now he'll have this e7 square for his knight, rather than this a5 one, which is sidelined, where now black has plans of playing, knight g6. And that's a good plan as well. Or playing g6, bishop g7, f5, and almost playing it like a King's Indian. So this is another way of playing for black. And I believe the aforementioned game continued bishop e3, rook b8, rook b8, knight d2, knight e7, and I believe white played knight g5 here. And after h6, bishop f7, rook f7, knight e6, the players repeated a couple times and then agreed to draw. Notice that black can't really go anywhere, because if queen b6, d takes e5 will win this bishop. And well, this may not have exactly been the game, because black had a5 for the queen. I think white had played it. Okay, sorry, I think I see what happened. After bishop f6, white plays a4, rook b8, a takes b5, a takes b5, bishop e3, and now black plays knight e7. So knight g5. And now if black plays a move other than h6, white will play queen h5, winning the bishop pair, and because of all the threats to h7 and f7, and then have an advantage for sure. So black has to play h6, and now bishop f7, rook f7, knight e6, queen e8, knight c7, and knight e6. And if black plays queen b6, then d takes e5 wins the bishop. So black needs to accept a draw here. Although in general, a draw with black, again, is not something that you should be ashamed of. It's good to be able to draw with the black pieces. I hear there's going to be an equalizing with black video coming out by another great video author, Roman Djingiashvili, sorry, I can't pronounce his name, but it's very important to be able to equalize as black. And if you can make a draw in this situation, that's great. And if white doesn't take the draw, then there's definitely still more play left in the position. Black will soon play knight g6, and he's maybe going to have ideas of playing knight f4. He can try to play like e takes d4, c takes d4, and then c5, again aiming for a Benoni structure. So there's really many things that black can try to, I guess, unbalance the game. So that's going to end part one of this series. Part two, I'm going to start looking at those lines I mentioned I wouldn't spend too much time on because they are Ruy Lopez. And in part three, I'm actually going to take a couple select games and go over them. So thanks.